Esther, I have to start with the Delta River project next week. It's a very interesting project, but honestly, I'm a bit nervous.
That's great, Adesh. I'm glad that you're going to manage the project by yourself. It's natural to feel that way, but I'm sure you will do well.
But I have never managed a project on my own, though I have worked on some humanitarian and development projects in the past. I'm not sure how to start.
Managing a project is like managing an event in our lives. We use available resources and complete tasks that allow the events to be completed within a specific time frame, like planning a wedding or moving from one place to another.
But why is project management so important in the humanitarian and development sector?
Project management is important in all sectors. Even with social projects, a lot can go wrong if they aren't managed well. And this may negatively impact the beneficiaries of that project. Let me explain this with an example.
Let's assume that a project requires us to build a simple swing on a tree with whatever is available. Now, what could potentially go wrong if we don't understand this well and mismanage it? If we do not understand the needs properly, we may design the wrong type of swing, or we may just design it poorly, ending up in complicating the design, or we may even end up setting an unrealistic expectation about the swing. After having understood the requirement well, consider the risk factors and how to mitigate them. What if you don't have enough resources to build the swing? What if it gets delayed and you complete it in the wrong season? What if you face a natural disaster after building it? There can be many more risk factors to think about and mitigate, such as a weak tree, which may not hold the swing, an unrealistic budget, and low quality of material. Think about it. If a simple project like building a swing takes so much consideration, how much will our humanitarian and development projects take? That's why we need to make sure that our projects are well designed, planned, and managed.
Yes, I see. I will need to put together a good plan for the Delta River project.
Yes, you will. It is also important to include accountability in your project plan.
To whom will I be accountable for the Delta River project?
Any humanitarian and development sector project calls for three-way accountability: downward, horizontal, and upward. Not clear? Here is what it means. The first level is called downward accountability, which means that we are accountable to the communities we serve through these projects. For example, in the Delta River project, you will have to consider the people who depend on the river for their day-to-day water requirements and how this project may impact them. You also want to make sure that people in communities who are affected by the project have a voice in its design and implementation. An intervention operating within a conflict context includes the principle of do no harm. The goal of this principle is to minimize negative impacts and maximize positive impacts of the intervention on conflict. This principle is also about not making things worse. For example, if you do a food distribution in a conflict zone with active conflict, you will probably turn beneficiaries into targets, making the situation much worse than before. Hence, you should avoid it.
The second level is called horizontal accountability, which focuses on the partnerships, relationships, and collaboration efforts with our peers and other organizations. For example, in your project, you must think about your team members, their strengths, and collaborate with them regularly.
The last level is called upward accountability, which considers the people who fund the project, such as the donors. Your project must align with the organizational strategy and achieve the defined outcomes. You now have a fair idea of why project management is important and how accountability matters.
Thanks. I have a lot more clarity now, but I still have some doubts.
You can ask me anything, and I will be happy to answer.
Thanks. I appreciate your advice. The first few questions that pop into my mind are, how do I manage my project and where do I start?
To start with, you need to be clear about your role in the project. Also, it would help if you divide the project into phases. It makes the project easier to plan and manage.
So, how can I define my role?
Pause and reflect on some of the questions related to the project manager's role.
Seems like the project manager is solely responsible for the completion of all of the work of the entire project.
While the project manager is responsible for project success, this does not mean that the project manager is solely responsible for the completion of the entire project.
Okay, so what should they do to ensure that the work is complete?
The project manager should collaborate closely with an array of stakeholders to ensure that the work of the project is completed. So, the project manager is responsible for making sure that the work of the project is being done, but this does not mean that they have to do everything by themselves. They need to manage and make sure that the team is doing all of the work. For successful project management, you need to strike a balance between soft skills related to human behavior and interactions and hard skills that focus on the technical management of inputs and outputs.
Understood. It is now clear that each successful project will need effective project management. Thank you for making it clear.
We have just learned that collaboration with others is important. Along with effective project management, you will need to focus on one more aspect. As you know already, people make projects. You can achieve your project goals as a result of the commitment, cooperation, collaboration, and contributions of the people on the project team. Therefore, managing people can be the project manager's most important job. Let's look at the skills required for this important job. Both soft and hard skills are very important to a successful project. As a project manager, for successful people management, you need to perform the following tasks as shown here.
The project manager is responsible for making sure the team, including the implementing partners, has the right combination and level of skills to implement the project. Developing the project team is the project manager's responsibility. The human resources team will help, but the responsibility is yours. Developing project staff can be challenging. However, it will serve several purposes and it needs to be considered before the project gets into full implementation mode. Developing the project team will ensure that they have the skills and tools required to implement the project more effectively. For example, the project manager needs to ensure that the team understands the organizational procurement processes since there will be a significant amount of procurement in the project.
Provide team members with incentives to stay with the project or organization by demonstrating that the project or organization is investing in their development. For example, the project manager should understand the learning and development needs of the team members and provide learning opportunities to them. Build individual and institutional capacity. For example, the project manager needs to understand the capacity and skill gaps of any implementing partner organizations and ensure that there is a plan to build skills through training to cover any gaps. This applies to both direct staff and implementing partner staff. If there are skill gaps, it will come back to hurt the project and probably at the worst possible time. Performance assessments are the informal assessment or formal documented assessment of the project team members' performance. You should be aware of the organizational procedures for conducting performance assessments with project team members and follow these procedures. You also need to give regular feedback and make sure that the project staff understands how their performance will be assessed. After analyzing the information, you can identify and resolve problems, reduce conflicts, and improve overall teamwork. As the leader of the project team, you should make sure that there is a steady and proactive flow of information and communication via meetings, workshops, reports, memos, and so on. Developing a culture of communication within the project team allows them to share information, actively work to identify issues and conflicts, and interact creatively to resolve issues. All this contributes to a more productive project environment.
As a project manager, your most important task will be to create an environment that is built on trust and is productive and collaborative to effective and efficient project management. No one likes to work with a dictator-like project manager, and it leads to a non-productive environment. You will also need to watch out for skill gaps. You may not realize that there are skills or capacity gaps until work starts. For example, if the project involves procuring various materials, and the staff lacks procurement skills, problems could arise in the project and work could get affected. Therefore, you assess these gaps and take necessary actions. Understand that skill gaps are risks and need to be mitigated. If they are not resolved, they will cause problems for the project.
Wow! I now have a fair idea of why people management is important and how I can manage and develop my team.
I am glad about that. There is one more thing that can guide you in the way you can approach projects. The principles of project management. They show you how to work and how to use different tools to plan and implement projects. There are 5 core principles of project management. These principles define a good project as well-governed, integrated, participatory, comprehensive, and adaptive. You can remember them using the acronym WIPCA. Go through each of these principles to understand what it is and why it is needed.
Great! The principles of project management are a really good guide to developing a systematic approach to any project.
True, and these principles are central to the role of the project manager. If the manager follows these principles, the project is more likely to be successful. Adesh is considering how to apply the principles in the context of the Delta River project. What factors should Adesh consider to make the project participatory? Which of these factors should Adesh consider to make the project more adaptive?
The project looks so much better now. You also mentioned dividing the project into smaller parts, right?
Yes, dividing it into smaller, digestible parts makes it easier to plan and manage. We use the simplified project phase model to achieve this.
Please tell me more about this model.
The simplified project phase model has 4 phases: project design, project planning, project implementation, and project closure. This is how it looks.
why do we need the simplified project phase model?
Using a project phase model approach makes it easier to plan and manage the project. The approach specifies what should be covered in each phase of the project and provides a comprehensive, balanced, and flexible structure to implement projects successfully. The simplified project phase model breaks the entire project into smaller pieces, and it also defines the terms from one phase to the other. The actions performed in one phase are carried over to the next one. There can also be overlap from one phase to another.
So, I may be starting one phase before the prior one ends.
Yes, and even in cases where one phase must be completed before the next one begins, there may be aspects of one phase which should be considered in other phases.
Can you give me an example?
Yes, one example would be project closure. While the closure activities take place towards the end of the implementation phase, the aspects of closure are considered right from the design phase and incorporated into the planning phase as well.
The simplified phase model looks like a great tool.
Yes, there is another tool called the triple constraint triangle, which helps you identify project constraints you will need to be mindful about.
What does it look like?
A triple constraint triangle looks somewhat like this. The three constraints on the three edges of the triangle are cost, scope, and time. Select each constraint to learn about it.
Fine. So, for my project, I will have to consider the same three constraints, right?
Yes, these remain pretty much the same for all projects. The triple constraint triangle for Delta River project looks like this.
So, if any one of these constraints changes, will it impact the other constraints? Or will they stay the same? If the project timeline changes and we need to build the latrines faster, what are our options?
Adesh, did you notice there is an interdependency between the triple constraints?
Yeah, I see that. But how do I ensure that there is a balance between them?
Let's see how you can do this. Project manager must ensure that the triple constraint triangle always stays in balance. The scope is the work we need to do within the parameters of time and costs. If we cannot achieve the defined scope in the given time frame, or if the resources are insufficient, then the triangle is not balanced. These constraints are interdependent. Whenever one of these is restricted or extended, the others will also need to be adjusted. In the case of the Delta River project, if you plan to provide access to quality latrines to 1,000 households, and suddenly the number of beneficiary households increases to 1,500, you may consider that the project scope has increased.
This is sure to pose a problem in project implementation.
This increased scope will require the cost or resources and the time to be proportionately increased. All in all, the project manager must understand the relationships and trade-offs between the constraints to effectively manage the project. Select the Close button to continue.
Got it. We should keep things flexible so we can adjust the constraints if need be.
Yes and no. What I mean is that, while the constraints have to be adjusted, in certain cases a constraint can be inflexible. Confused? Let me explain this better. An inflexible constraint is the most critical factor, and it must be contained for project success. Any change in such a constraint may have a negative impact on the project. Let's look at the examples of time and cost as inflexible constraints.
Then, are all constraints always inflexible?
No. Sometimes constraints can also be flexible and adaptable. They do allow us to accommodate minor changes. Here is how you can understand this in the context of the Delta River project.
Great info, Esther. That means that we need to understand which constraints are flexible and which ones are inflexible.
Absolutely. By classifying the constraints, you can have better clarity and control over your project. Also, make sure to get all your stakeholders to agree upon the constraints early in the project. It is very difficult to negotiate these constraints after the project is launched.
Sure, I will remember that.
Now that Adesh has the background of the Delta River project and the knowledge of the simplified project phase model, what should be Adesh's next step? Choose your response and select Submit. For successful project implementation, Adesh needs additional information. What should be Adesh's next step? Choose your response and select Submit.
Thanks for these inputs. I feel so much better and confident to start the project now.
You are welcome. Please don't hesitate to ask anything more.
Thanks. I'm sure I'll need your guidance throughout the project.
Adesh seems to have grasped things very quickly. Here is what he needs to keep in mind about managing a project.